ancient punishments that are worse than death throughout human history. Death has been considered the ultimate punishment. But our ancestors, in their darkest creativity, devised fates so horrific that the condemned would beg for the mercy of a quick execution. These were punishments designed not just to end life, but to destroy the human spirit before the body finally surrendered. Today, we explore the most terrifying punishments ever conceived by human minds, torments so cruel that death would have been a blessing. Our journey begins in ancient Persia, in the court of kings who ruled vast empires with absolute authority. Here was born perhaps the most psychologically devastating punishment ever recorded: scaphism, known to history as the boats. Picture this. A criminal is brought before the Persian court, perhaps guilty of treason or murder. Instead of a quick beheading, the judges pronounce a sentence that makes witnesses shudder. The condemned is stripped naked and forced into a narrow boat with only their head, hands, and feet protruding. A second boat is placed on top, creating a wooden coffin with the victim trapped inside. But this is only the beginning of the horror. The victim is force-fed milk and honey until they develop severe diarrhea. More honey is smeared on their exposed face, hands, and feet. Then, this human prison is set afloat on a stagnant pond, exposed to the blazing desert sun. What happens next is a nightmare of biology and psychology combined. The honey attracts every insect in the region. Flies, wasps, beetles, and other creatures swarm to the sweet substance, but they cannot distinguish between honey and human flesh. They begin to burrow into the victim's eyes, nose, mouth, and any other opening they can find. The forced feeding continues daily, ensuring the victim remains conscious and strong enough to suffer. The diarrhea, trapped in the boat with them, creates a breeding ground for maggots and parasites. These creatures begin consuming the victim from the inside, while insects devour them from the outside. Historical accounts suggest that victims of scaphism could survive for weeks in this condition, their minds broken long before their bodies finally succumbed. The Persian historian Plutarch recorded that some victims lived for 17 days, becoming living ecosystems of decay and despair. But the Persians were not alone in their creativity with suffering. In ancient China, during various dynasties, there existed a punishment called lingxi, known in the West as death by 1,000 cuts. But this name understates the true horror of the practice. It wasn't about the cuts themselves, but about the deliberate, artistic prolonging of death. Lingxi was reserved for the most serious crimes: treason, patricide, or mass murder. The victim would be tied to a wooden frame in a public square, and an executioner, trained in anatomy and skilled with a blade, would begin the process. The first cuts were shallow, designed to cause maximum pain without threatening vital organs. Pieces of flesh, no larger than a fingernail, would be removed from non-essential areas. The executioner would work with the precision of a surgeon, ensuring each cut was perfectly placed to maintain consciousness and maximize suffering. The crowd would watch as the victim's body was slowly disassembled, piece by piece. But the true torture was not physical. It was the knowledge that this agony could continue for hours or even days, depending on the executioner's skill and the judge's mercy. Records from the Qing dynasty describe executions where the victim received over 3,000 individual cuts before death finally claimed them. The executioner would periodically offer the victim wine laced with opium, not as mercy, but to ensure they remained conscious for the complete experience. The psychological impact on witnesses was intentional. Lingqi was not just punishment for the criminal, but a warning to society about the consequences of challenging imperial authority. Moving westward, we encounter the Roman Empire, masters of engineering who applied their technical expertise to the art of punishment. Among their most feared creations was crucifixion, but not the relatively quick death often portrayed in modern media. Roman crucifixion was designed to maximize suffering and public humiliation. The condemned would first be scourged with a flagrum, a multi-tailed whip embedded with pieces of bone, metal, and glass. This pre-punishment alone could be fatal, stripping flesh from bone and causing massive blood loss. Those who survived the scourging would then be forced to carry the crossbeam of their cross through the streets, allowing citizens to mock and abuse them. Upon reaching the execution site, the victim would be nailed through the wrists and feet to the wooden frame. But here's where Roman engineering made crucifixion truly horrific. The position of the body made breathing extremely difficult. To inhale, the victim had to push up on their nailed feet, causing excruciating pain. To exhale, they had to allow their body weight to hang from their nailed wrists, causing different but equally intense agony. This created a cruel cycle where the victim had to choose between suffocation and torture with every breath. Death typically came from exhaustion, dehydration, or asphyxiation, but could take days. Roman soldiers would sometimes break the victim's legs to hasten death, not as mercy, but to clear the execution site for other uses. Historical records describe victims of crucifixion begging passersby to end their suffering, offering their possessions to anyone who would grant them a quick death. The Romans, understanding the power of psychological warfare, often obliged by making the death even slower. In medieval Europe, the wheel became one of the most feared instruments of execution. But like other punishments on our list, the wheel was designed to make death a distant goal rather than an immediate outcome. The victim would be tied spread eagle to a large wooden wheel. The executioner would then use a heavy hammer or iron bar to systematically break every major bone in the victim's body, starting with the limbs and working toward the torso. The breaking was done carefully, ensuring that no blow would be immediately fatal. After the bones were broken, the wheel would be raised on a pole and displayed publicly, with the victim still alive but unable to move. The broken limbs would be woven through the spokes of the wheel, creating a grotesque human pretzel that could survive for days in this condition. The wheel combined physical agony with psychological torture. Victims were conscious but completely helpless, exposed to weather, insects, and the mockery of crowds. Dehydration and exposure would eventually claim them, but not before they had endured days of complete helplessness and unimaginable pain. But perhaps no ancient punishment was more psychologically devastating than one practiced by various cultures: being buried alive while conscious. This punishment took many forms across different civilizations. In some cultures, the victim would be placed in a wooden box with a small air hole and buried in a shallow grave. In others, they would be placed in a tomb with enough food and water to survive for several days. The horror of live burial was not just the eventual suffocation, but the complete sensory deprivation and psychological terror that preceded death. Victims would claw at the walls of their prison until their fingers bled, scream until their voices gave out, and slowly descend into madness as oxygen ran low and claustrophobia overwhelmed their minds. Archaeological evidence has revealed graves where victims clearly struggled violently before death, with scratches on the inside of coffins and evidence of desperate attempts to escape. The terror of being buried alive was so profound that it influenced burial customs for centuries, with many cultures developing elaborate safeguards to ensure the dead were truly deceased before interment. In ancient Egypt, there existed a punishment reserved for those who desecrated tombs or committed crimes against the gods: being sealed alive in a sarcophagus with scarab beetles. The victim would be placed in a stone coffin with hundreds of these flesh-eating insects. The sarcophagus would then be sealed, creating a living tomb where the person would be slowly consumed by the beetles while trapped in complete darkness. The process could take weeks, as scarab beetles prefer to eat their prey alive, starting with soft tissues and working inward. This punishment was particularly terrifying to ancient Egyptians because it denied the victim any possibility of proper mummification or afterlife. They would be consumed completely, leaving nothing for the journey to the next world, a fate worse than death in Egyptian religious belief. Moving to the Americas, the Aztec civilization developed punishments that combined physical torture with spiritual destruction. One of the most feared was the ritual of Xochimilquistli, or flowery death. Victims of this punishment would be tied to a frame and have their skin slowly peeled away in strips, starting from the extremities and working inward. But the strips were not removed randomly. They were carefully cut in patterns that resembled flower petals, hence the name flowery death. The victim would remain conscious throughout this process, watching their own skin being artistically removed and arranged around them like a grotesque garden. The Aztecs believed this punishment not only destroyed the body, but also the soul, preventing the victim from joining their ancestors in the afterlife. In ancient India, there existed a punishment called Gajasura Moksha, or death by elephant. But this was not simply being trampled by an elephant. The punishment was far more elaborate and cruel. The victim would be tied beneath a trained elephant with their head positioned directly under the animal's foot. The elephant would then be commanded to slowly lower its foot, applying increasing pressure to the victim's skull. The process was gradual, allowing the victim to feel their skull slowly cracking and their consciousness fading over several minutes. The psychological torture was immense. Victims could see the massive foot descending, could feel the increasing pressure, and knew exactly how their death would occur, but were powerless to prevent it. Some accounts describe victims begging the elephant handlers to simply let the animal step down quickly, but mercy was rarely granted. Perhaps one of the most ingenious and terrifying punishments came from ancient Assyria, the practice of flaying or removing skin while the victim remained alive. Assyrian flaying was not a crude process of tearing skin away, but a precise medical procedure performed by skilled practitioners. The victim would be restrained on a specially designed table, and the flayer would begin making careful incisions around the wrists and ankles. Using sharp knives and specialized tools, the skin would be slowly peeled away from the underlying muscle, like removing a garment. The process required considerable skill to avoid cutting too deep and causing immediate death. Master flayers could remove entire sections of skin while keeping the victim conscious and aware. The psychological impact was devastating. Victims could watch their own skin being removed and hung up to dry like animal hide. The exposure of raw nerve endings created pain beyond description, while the removal of the body's protective barrier made every movement agony. But what made these ancient punishments truly worse than death was not just their physical cruelty, but their psychological impact on both victim and society. These punishments were designed to break the human spirit completely. They attacked not just the body, but the mind, the dignity, and the very sense of self. Victims often descended into madness long before death claimed them, their minds unable to process the extremity of their suffering. For society, these punishments served as ultimate deterrence. The knowledge that certain crimes could result in fates worse than death created a level of fear that simple execution could never achieve. The public nature of many of these punishments meant that entire populations lived with the knowledge of what could happen to those who transgressed. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these punishments is what they reveal about human nature itself. These were not the products of mad individuals, but organized, systematic methods of torture developed by civilized societies. They required planning, skill, and often considerable resources to implement. The creativity involved in developing these punishments shows a dark aspect of human intelligence, the ability to imagine and inflict suffering that goes far beyond any reasonable concept of justice or deterrence. These punishments were art forms of cruelty, refined over generations and passed down as techniques of statecraft. Modern psychology has studied the accounts of these ancient punishments and concluded that many victims would have suffered what we now recognize as severe psychological trauma long before their physical death. The combination of pain, helplessness, and the knowledge of inevitable doom would have created a mental state beyond anything we can fully comprehend. Yet, these punishments also reveal something about human resilience. Historical accounts describe victims who maintained their sanity and dignity even under the most extreme circumstances. Some used their final hours to make speeches, offer forgiveness to their torturers, or provide comfort to other victims. In studying these ancient punishments, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, cruelty, and human nature. What drives a civilization to develop such elaborate methods of causing suffering? How do societies justify torments that exceed any reasonable definition of punishment? Perhaps most importantly, these historical horrors remind us of how far we have come in our understanding of human rights and dignity. The fact that such punishments are now universally condemned represents genuine progress in human moral development. But they also serve as a warning about the potential for cruelty that lies within human nature. The same intelligence that created art, literature, and philosophy also devised these instruments of torture. The capacity for both creation and destruction exists within every human society. As we reflect on these ancient punishments that were truly worse than death, we are reminded that the price of civilization is constant vigilance against our own darker impulses. These historical horrors must never be forgotten, not because we wish to dwell on human cruelty, but because remembering them helps ensure they are never repeated. The echoes of ancient screams have long since faded, but the lessons they teach about human nature, justice, and the precious value of mercy remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago.